Listen, this is going to hand you a lot of laughs. There's a man been coming into my office now for months, and well, you got that gadget working, Sam?
All set, Mr. Simpson.
Okay, let her go.
Hello. This is a demonstration of a talking picture. Notice, it is a picture of me and I am talking. Note how my lips and the sounds issuing from them are synchronized together in perfect unison. Since the earliest days of the cinema...
There's somebody talking behind that screen.
Come out from behind that screen, Mr. Simpson.
No, I'm right here.
Of our pioneer inventor. My voice has been recorded on a record. A talking picture. Goodbye.
Well,
It's just a toy.
It's a screen.
It's vulgar.
RF, do you think they'll ever really use it?
I doubt it. The Warner Brothers are making a whole talking picture with this gadget. The jazz singer. They'll lose their shirts. What do you think of it, Dexter?
It'll never amount to a thing.
Yeah, that's what they said about the horseless carriage.
Well, let's get on with the show. Okay, boys. Come on, my little starlets.
This is it. This is the beginning of the end. Sound, you know, it's going to change everything. It's just going to basically start all over again. A whole new thing starting. When you look at the films I've discussed so far, you can see the progress from how we've come from theatre type films to more modern feeling films and how the language is formed. And by taking it back to talking, perhaps we're just going backwards, perhaps we're going back to theatre. Obviously, when you have this modern day perspective, we know that sound is awesome. And I'm personally looking forward to getting out of this silent era because I've been kind of tired of watching fucking silent films. It's a bit exhausting. I'm really excited for this change. It didn't take off immediately, and that's something that's important about this video. We're not just going to see loads of sound films. In fact, most of the films are silent still, but I am going to sort of talk about the first talkies, how they came about, but before they actually flourished. As I do with every episode, I have seen 20 films from this time period. Yeah, I did find putting 10 films into this list a lot harder than usual. And you'll notice that this isn't even covering 5 years, this is covering 3 years. It's getting a lot harder to squeeze so many good films. So the format of this is changing, as is the format of films changing in the series. I think it works quite nicely. But anyway, let's start with number 10. Number 10 is Lights of New York. This is the first full talkie film. Now you might think that you're either a talkie or you're not, but actually that isn't the case. There are films, which I will get into later in this video, that had sound but not throughout. They were still basically a silent film with sound sequences. This is actually the first time we see it properly, and you can really understand why people would not take this seriously. And I think the main reason for this, there's not really much going on visually, it's all very bland theatre looking. The acting itself is incredibly stiff.
I'd loan you the money in a moment, but I cannot afford to lose it, and you cannot afford to fail.
Oh, don't you worry about me failing, Mother. I'm just sure everything's gonna come out great.
Just incredibly unnatural and yeah, I just don't like it. It's not, it doesn't seem like a worthwhile upgrade to what we already have established here with, you know, other great films, other great silent performances. It's overall just a bit awkward and corny. No wonder people wouldn't take sound seriously when this is sort of model you're offering. But once I kind of got past that, and once I sort of enjoyed it as like, okay, yeah, this is kind of cheesy, you know, it's not there yet. This is just really them figuring it out and not really that well. Yeah, I started to get a bit more of an ironic enjoyment. I started to sort of laugh at the bad, stiff acting, laugh at the style of acting, laugh at the whole production quality. It reminded me a lot of those sort of so bad they're good movies from the sort of 50s and 60s, the TV movies, Plan 9 from Outer Space.
You see? You're stupid minds! Stupid!
If you can sort of enjoy this in a way of more taking the piss out of it and also on a historical way, you should have a good time with this.
You didn't say that when you wanted me to stick by you through all the tough times.
Oh, save that gab, will you? Why don't you get yourself a tambourine and go out on the corner and peddle your blues?
You be careful that you're not singing the blues, Hawk. You think you can pick any chicken you want and throw me back in the deck.
The story itself is really bland, I think. It's basically like, oh, gangster frames this guy in Brooklyn and stuff. It's just, pretty boring story, and the presentation really is not grabbing you in a way that makes you want to get into the story. If you want a story like that and a sound film like that, I would highly recommend The Roaring Twenties. Generally covers all the bases that this film tries to cover, just in a way more entertaining way. If you're looking at the whole film, I don't think a lot of this film is that good, but if you can just sort of be like, yeah, I'm going to have a laugh, I'm just going to watch this really bad sort of attempt at a theatre play being adapted into a film, and I give a few points also for the historical relevance of this film. At number 9, we've got The General. This is another Buster Keaton film, this time set in the American Civil War. Keaton, Johnny, is this train driver engineer, and basically everyone thinks he's a coward. Everyone's like, you're a coward, you're small, you're not a proper man, partially just because of how he is, and partially because he won't get accepted into the war. He has a girl he likes and he needs to prove himself. And so the way that he does that is through this rescue mission where he's basically trying to save the girl of his dreams from the Civil War baddies. He's got to, do what he does best, drive trains and save her. I did feel a lot of Birth of a Nation in this, with the Civil War setting and just general plot beats. And also The Great Train Robbery came to mind. So yeah, it takes sort of elements of all those kind of films and creates a pretty fun comedy out of it. The big action set piece of the train chase, it's quite a slow paced thing. It's not as fast as, say, in Sherlock Jr. where they're driving along their cars, speeding along. It's not that same pace. It's a lot more just like plodding setup with the train in a backdrop. I don't know how to explain it, but it's just like, yeah, it's very slow, methodical, and all these sort of sequences are just filmed on the train. It's a different structure, but it's a structure I really welcome. I really enjoy that style. It's not just bat, but it's still got that same satisfying building tension. The only times that I felt like it fell apart was when it broke that structure. I actually think this would have been better as just one big chase set piece on a train, because those were the best parts of the film. Don't get me wrong, some cool Civil War scenes, but the strongest parts were that for me. So I think if you just you made it so the hook of the thing was like, yeah, you're basically watching one big chase, that I would have liked a bit more. This isn't Buster Keaton's finest, but it's a good film. At number 8, we have A Page of Madness, which, as far as I can recall, this is the first ever Asian film I've discussed in this series. Also, one of the most abstract, experimental and surreal films I've discussed so far. The overall style with the visuals and music, very cutting edge, very different. It's so different that you can't really describe it. Very avant-garde in that sense. Most of the time they're very classical opera house type soundtracks, but this is just like alien. This is completely just an incredibly different tone and atmosphere that really is quite timeless as well. It's always going to be uncomfortable, unnerving, and it's not going to age in that same way, because it's just like, what? I've never seen anything like this, and even if this came out now, this would be weird. And for me, though I love that, it's also sort of the downfall for the film, I think. I love a good artsy film. I like my mind to be tested. However, I do feel I need some substance there to let me chew on while I'm seeing nonsense, basically. Like, if you're going to show me nonsense, give me something to think about and provoke my thoughts, because otherwise I'm just sort of there like, okay, well, now I'm just seeing nonsense. A great example of that, I think, is Inland Empire. A lot of just scenes that you don't understand, because there's all these loose thematics going on. You're like, oh, what does this mean? What does this mean? This didn't have that so much, which is a real shame, because the atmosphere itself is excellent, but I needed something carrying that. And the plot of this could have been that. It's a pretty simple plot, really. As a story, it's not so different to something like The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but this really goes all out to break the rules. This really does not hold back. It wants to break every rule it can and be as different as it can. That's shown no better through the fact that it has no intertitles, which really makes it a lot harder to follow. That's a very bold, respectable move, but it's just like, at a certain point, stop being so artsy, because I want to actually get into it too. I think overall this would have worked better as a short film, because there's lots of great moments and a lot of great things going on, but such a big thing to tackle when there's no guidance with intertitles or anything. It's tethering on that line of my enjoyment and just being a bit like too far gone. So yeah, for that reason I don't rank this higher. But I really fucking respect this because I haven't seen any film like this from this early on. You know, most films that are this crazy you would expect not to see until at least the 40s. That's the first time I could think of films being that sort of crazy. So yeah, this is a first of its kind. At number 7 we have The Jazz Singer. Now this is what people consider the first actual talkie, the first thing to ever have sound. If you go in expecting that, you might not have such a good time because actually only a couple sequences of sound. It's just the sort of singing sequences and the odd dialogue sequence. Aside from being the first sound film, it's also worth mentioning that this stars Al Jolson, who apparently was super famous, apparently was considered more famous than Frank Sinatra, Presley and all that in the 50s, 40s. Like, he was considered that legend, just that big singer that changed everything, introduced a more jazzy style of music into the scene. Now I think the music sounds kind of crap.
Making noise, breaking toys, always fighting the boys. But his eyes, his mother's, and they're a vision to see.
Like, I respect it for changing the medium, you know, introducing audiences to something a bit different, which eventually would lead to all kinds of great things like Sinatra and stuff. That's my understanding of this guy. But yeah, looking at it from modern day, I don't like this music at all, really. It sounds all folksy. But yeah, Al Jolson and his style of music, and I guess you could say this film as well, really broke the mold of how we saw film or music. A lot of people will recognise this film for having quite notorious blackface. I'm going to get into that shortly. But firstly, I want to start by talking about more of the sound. I wish that sound was used better in this, and I don't mind that it's limited in how it's used, because I get they couldn't use it all the time, it wasn't quite there yet. So having it for the singing scenes, that made a lot of sense. But what I didn't understand is then they would have it for dialogue scenes too, which was really cool. It was like, oh wow, I'm actually seeing, you know, synced up people talking just like how we see films now. There was something quite extraordinary about seeing that for the first time.
Shut him for little Jackie. Oh, I'm going to steal something. I'll give it back to you someday too, you see if I don't. Mama, darling, if I'm a success in this show, well, we're going to move from here. Oh yes, we're going to move up in the Bronx.
It wasn't used purposefully. It kind of felt like random as to when they would use it. Like sometimes he's talking to his mum and they're using it, but then he's talking to some other guy and it's not using it. Could you not have been clever and been like, when he goes to New York and finds fame, then suddenly he can start talking to people, but when he's at home and he feels, you know, he feels like he needs to break out of his shell, the film's silent. I think back to when The Wizard of Oz introduced colour, and I think about how she had her real life and it was all black and white and grey, sepia type style, and then she'd walk into this dreamland and suddenly everything's colourful. This film didn't do that, and I don't know why it didn't take that opportunity, honestly. You've got a new technology and you just decide to be like, well, pop it in there, pop it in there, pop it in there. Find some purpose in the sound. I think that could have been effective. A lot of people know this film for its notorious blackface scene, which, having now seen the film, I realised wasn't quite as racist as people were making it out to be. Because in this film there's a lot of themes about his Jewish identity and wanting to do these sort of modern songs while also being called to sing at his dying father's funeral type service. So there's this battle between like my old religion and the new ways of the world. I feel like there's definitely a clear commentary on wearing different faces and personas as an artist. I think that's lost in translation when you don't really watch the film properly and understand the story of it, because you've got to remember blackface was just a typical thing back then. I think the problem is definitely more to do with the society than him doing it in this film itself. I would recommend a video I watched, Al Jolson, Misunderstood Hero or Villain. It gave me a bit of insight into that, and I think it's worth watching if you want a bit of insight into that, because yeah, I'm certainly not an expert. I'm just sort of relaying some of my thoughts on that topic. If you go in being like, okay, there's going to be some sound sequences, this is a silent film, but you're going to have some sound sequences, some singing songs in there. It's basically the first proper musical, really, as opposed to the first sound film. It's got a solid story, it's got some good sequences, it's a good film overall, and I would recommend it. At number 6 we have The Wind, a film by Victor Seastrom. I've talked about his films a few times now, and another one where I'm a bit like, I want to like you more, I want to like you more. It stars Lillian Gish from Birth of a Nation and widely considered the first film star. So she's in this and she moves to the West with her dislikable family, her cousin, and they're just bratty, dislikable, just a very depressing area and a very depressing lifestyle that these people live in. And you can imagine why this would be pretty shit for her, you know, coming from a nice suburban neighbourhood to these empty, vast desert areas, and so she's very receptive to being taken advantage of, and she is taken advantage of in this location. I think that's a great premise. I think it's very intriguing, this location, this setting, what these people are going to do to her. It just falls apart from there. It doesn't give you more than that. I personally was just a bit like, oh come on, like what else? A lot like He Who Gets Slapped, I felt like, okay, yeah, you're setting up some cool premises, some cool ideas, some cool themes, and what else is there, you know? Explore. The same goes for this film. A very good sense of direction and atmosphere and style, but the story just really not doing enough for me. I really like the direction of Seastrom, but as an overall product, I don't get that sense of satisfaction from watching it. I don't feel rewarded for my patience, unfortunately. At number 5, we have The Man Who Laughs. So this is a film set in 17th century England, following a man who is brutally disfigured. He has like a little smile carved into his face, so he's basically permanently laughing. If this sounds familiar, then you will recognise it because it's the Joker. This is the film that inspired the Joker. Before seeing this film, I initially thought that it was more of a visual design, like the character design came from this film. But now having seen the film, actually it's more than that. There's a lot of similarities in the story. You know, look no further than the idea that this kid had a smile carved into his face. That's exactly the same as Joker.
He sticks the blade in my mouth. Let's put a smile on that face. And why so serious?
I think the laughing man in this looks most like the Joker in the Arkham games. But I'm not really into all that shit. I'm a film guy. I like my occasional Batman film, don't get me wrong. But yeah, who doesn't like the Joker? Let's be real. The Joker is a good character, and it's great to see what inspired it. I should point out, this isn't actually a completely original idea in this film either. This film is based on a book called The Man Who Laughs. So yeah, the real first Joker is that book. But yeah, I really enjoyed this film. It had a very good production quality, a lot of satisfying shots and sequences to watch. I really enjoyed this long tracking shot when they basically mug this guy or kidnap him, and it feels like the camera moves along and the shot dynamically changes from like a medium to a sort of wide shot of the mugging and then back to a close-up and stuff. It just, yeah, I love the way that it flowed and changed like that. I liked the just inherent darkness of this story, the obvious one being the carving of the smile, but throughout this film had a lot of dark imagery and themes going on. I especially enjoyed the villain death. I thought that was probably one of the best villain deaths I've seen in such an old film. Very satisfyingly gruesome, you know, it's got that proper like, oh yeah, kill that fucking villain guy. Great use of violence. There was also a romance story going on, which in silent films, as I've sort of discussed throughout the series, I feel was a very hit or miss area. The romance I thought was good in this though. It was between him and a blind girl, so there was some obvious chemistry where, you know, she couldn't see his disfigurement and he could appreciate her without judgment of others. So that was all interesting. These iconic scenes just turn up again and again in different films because of just how iconic and well made this film is overall. The plot of this is very similar to He Who Gets Slapped, but I thought that this one was a lot better, a lot more fleshed out and a lot more satisfying in its payoffs. And number 4 we have Wings. This film is very similar to J'accuse, which I've talked about. Not as good as J'accuse, but very similar. Both have a love triangle with two men who get sent off to war. The same war as well, World War I. And just as in J'accuse, the war brings these two characters closer. This is essentially an American remake. From what I can understand from my general research, it's actually not an American remake, but yeah, in my head that is what it is because it's so similar and Americanized in every way. From the filmmaking to how, you know, in J'accuse, the filmmaking is very experimental and quite artsy and striking. In Wings, the filmmaking is still like that, but very different. It's not quite as out there, but it has a very modern feeling to it. The tracking shots really make it feel like that. The over-the-shoulder and low-angle shots really give it that sense of depth that you don't see in a lot of silent films. Just really gives it that dynamic feeling where the camera can really just be any place rather than situated somewhere. Obviously, there's the really famous tracking shot, which is just awesome, going through all the tables. And also down to the implementation of sound and colour. It's very subtle. You know, you just get colorization of all the sort of muzzle flashes and fire effects, and there's also sounds for just the gunfire. All these little tricks like the sound and the visuals and all that stuff, it all just serves to enhance and modernize but not directly show off about it. Battle scenes are certainly a lot better than JQ's, just down to that use of sound. The best feature of this film though is definitely the plane scenes. Like, oh my god, putting the cameras on the plane like that. Thank god they didn't do this in a studio with like some shitty backdrop. The director actually waited for there to be clouds so that it didn't look like they were just behind a backdrop and you could actually get a sense of movement. Top Gun Maverick has had a lot of praise for the same kind of scene, yet this is like 100 years ago and it's actually practically done, unlike Top Gun Maverick. As much as Top Gun Maverick claims to be practical, a lot of people also know that it's technically not really. This is an actual practically done real life battle plane sequence and it looks excellent and still holds up to this day. My problem though would be that they abuse the plane scenes a bit. Like, it takes up a good half an hour of the film. They do look incredible, don't get me wrong, but I don't need to see it more than a couple times really. Luckily they change it up enough where there are also some scenes from the trenches. They also look excellent. They're also just brutal. Yeah, the battle sequences, maybe some of the best I've seen in silent films. Hated the bubble scene. Like, what was that about? Was that like funny in the 20s? Were people just missing alcohol that much that they started to think it was that fucking crazy? The ending of this film was a bit flat, I thought. I was a bit like, oh, okay. Like, if we're going back to the comparison of JQ's in this film, the ending in JQ's is far stronger. I overall do prefer JQ's for its more profound and human approach to the subject of war. This is very much an American remake in that, right? The way that it discusses the subject of war is a lot more like, oh, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's violent. And I like that too, but JQ's wins just because of the incredible way that it tackles such a subject. But I like Wings, and I recommend Wings. At number 3, we have Two Tars, the first Laurel and Hardy film I've talked about. Now, I am a Laurel and Hardy fan. I myself am called Stan. I'm named after Stan Laurel. My dad is a ridiculously big fan of Laurel and Hardy. He's obsessed with it. He's got Laurel and Hardy shit all over his house. And this was actually my favourite Laurel and Hardy film when I was a kid. And having watched it again recently, I think it's the best silent Laurel and Hardy film. So I need to stop saying Laurel and Hardy so many times. It's starting to annoy me, yet alone, I'm sure, people watching this. That iconic vintage 30s comedy soundtrack, the overall art style with the intertitles and things, I love the vibe of these films. It's no secret that their medium is ultimately sound. Sound is where these guys really take off.
Why don't you put some ice in it?
Even though they are better when it comes to sound, I still think this is one of the best silent slapstick films. It's very cartoony, very wacky, but their chemistry and their dynamic as two friends. Okay, at a certain point with these kind of films, I'm often like, oh, he's been hit, he's fallen over, very funny. But because these characters are that good, I'm hooked into the story the whole way through. Basically, Stan and Ollie pick up two girls, and you can see from the very beginning with the gun machine, these girls are a bad influence on them and how it will make them sort of behave badly. And the extremes they take this just goes up and up as they sort of get involved in a road rage incident, and that road rage incident just keeps on going up and up and up until it's ridiculous. They're responsible for a massive road war. This scenario was done by them before in the Battle of the Century, but I think this one works so much better because the root of the problem is inherently these girls. One of my favourite shots in this is towards the end when they're watching all the different damaged cars go past, and it's absolutely insane how ridiculous they go with that, and just watching them laughing and reacting like in such a wholesome and realistic way. See, if it was just the stupid car shit without them, I wouldn't find that so funny, but it's them being there like watching it and like giggling away. This is the best Laurel and Hardy silent film. At number 2, we have Metropolis by Fritz Lang. Fritz Lang is a pretty iconic German filmmaker. This is definitely his most famous film. I've talked about A Trip to the Moon, A Trip to Mars. Those are okay sci-fi films. This is it's so good that it inspired so many other great sci-fis. You can really clearly see the parallels between this and Blade Runner, and also the art direction in Tim Burton's Batman films. Can't believe I've talked about Tim Burton's Batman films more than once in this video. That's quite strange. This isn't the way that it is, but in my head, this is my headcanon, there is a Blade Runner trilogy. So you start off with this one, this is like the origin story, and then you get Blade Runner set 40, 60 years later, and Blade Runner 2049 set another 50, 60 years later. That's how people should watch it. You should be watching Metropolis, then Blade Runner, and Blade Runner 2049, and imagine they're all linked. Because if that was the case, that would be so cool. One of the main themes and concepts that this film explores is AI, which is crazy because that's still such a big discussion now, as it was in Blade Runner. So the way that this theme is explored, it's a pretty traditional story. You're introduced to the city of Metropolis through the perspective of Freda, who is the son of the master, the guy who runs the whole thing. In his eyes, it's just some crazy utopia. It looks amazing, it looks beautiful. Look at this amazing city. And yeah, they did not let down on that. The art department absolutely nailed it. But then Fredo has this sort of crazy spiritual awakening where he sees the truth, he understands that this society is not really as great as it seems. There's all these other things going on below the surface that create this utopia. It's a very black and white way, no pun intended, very black and white way of viewing our current society and sort of breaking down the problems in the world, which is what all great science fiction does in my opinion. You have this sort of Jesus saviour type figure, this beacon of hope for people. She speaks these great truths, and so the Master's like, we can't have that, we need to turn her evil, we need to turn her into an AI thing. The performance that Bridget Helm gives here is absolutely incredible. She's only around 18 at this point, and she plays both sides absolutely magnificently. I was completely engrossed in her as this saviour of mankind, this beacon of hope. I was really like, wow, she's so angelic and pure, and she's going to bring some hope to these people. And when you see her change, she sold it completely, and it perhaps the best silent performance of all time. I would go that far. Absolutely amazing. That being said, I do think that all the actors in... Shut the fuck up! That being said, I think that all the actors in this were absolutely amazing. Everyone was great, but she was definitely the standout for me. If I had one big criticism for this film, it would be the last act. All the stories kind of wrapping up, you know, you got the uprisal, they're taking over. I think that's all fine, it's a perfectly solid ending. But we didn't need it for as much as we did. It took up a lot of time. These science fiction concepts are really doing the heavy lifting, so why do we really need all this long-winded closure? It's not really necessary. If I had my dream cut of this, it would take out about half an hour or so of just of that stuff. I've already said it before, but visually, absolutely gorgeous, mainly with the design of the city, but also I think with the just set design from the lab of the inventor. There's like a science fiction Frankenstein thing going on there. All the effects with the transformation looks excellent, and also just the sets of the city are very impressive, very grand. The combination of sets and the art direction and architecture just makes this whole world of Metropolis feel so real. And I love how that's contrasted with this traditional storytelling, the way that these fairy tale sort of elements bleed into it as like long gone history. Overall, just wonderfully crafted and really set the standard for science fiction. Best silent sci-fi film ever. At number 1, we have Napoleon by Abel Gance. So after J'accuse and The Whale, D.W. Griffith himself actually offered Gance a position at MGM to come along and direct some films for Hollywood. But Gance rejected this because he had something bigger in mind. He had his 5.5-hour epic Napoleon film ready to make, and he made it, and holy shit. 5.5 hours just documenting Napoleon's early life and his amazing military career. This, in my opinion, and in most people's opinion, is Abel Gance's magnum opus. The purpose of this is clear, the execution is very good, very historically accurate. There's actually moments where it uses intertitles to sort of tell you when things are historic and not historic, so you know exactly what's being fictionalized and what's not. It will even just take a break and just be like, hold on a minute, we're just going to take a moment here to see Napoleon's hometown and get to know what his life would have been like. It just completely takes you out the film and lends a moment to give you some history, which I love. I think that's a great way of doing it. And this is something that I think is crucially missing from that new Napoleon film, the Ridley Scott Napoleon. And there's a quote of him even saying about it, like, oh, he took over Egypt, so in the film he starts blowing up all the pyramids. It's ridiculous. This is such a contrast to that, where there is a real sort of importance placed on the history. Obviously this film is incredibly long, 5.5 hours, that's a big feat of a task. Not many people are going to want to watch that. But I don't think it's too badly paced. I think that for almost the entire film I was enjoying it. I would admittedly take off a good hour. I was doing a cut of this, like a series cut, but I've got copyright strikes on that. If I get another copyright strike, my channel's gone, so I'm not taking any risks putting that third part out, unfortunately. I think the pacing is very good for how long this film is. It sets out to document a lot of his life and a lot of different battles and chapters of his life. So I think it manages to pace that quite well. It's working with some really good source material, and Gance's direction is just elevating that source material in such an amazing way. It's so full of life, this film. Like, okay, this is a long film, yeah, but maybe every half an hour or so it feels like there's something striking or visually impressive or new that I'm seeing that's keeping me enticed into the story. Some standouts would include the handheld footage, the shaky cam. That's a technique that we're not really used to seeing until maybe Kubrick days. There wasn't really such thing as a handheld camera at that point, so to actually achieve this was very difficult and a lot of work just to achieve a POV shot essentially. It really plants the audience into the chaos of the battle and the chaos of the situation, you know, whether that be from a horse or in a snowball fight. It really immerses you and gets you right into that tension. The montage editing, again, I've talked about this before, it's definitely not first done here. It's done in another one of his films, The Whale, but it's still really well done here and still pretty early days for that idea. Perhaps coolest of all though is the widening aspect ratio in the last part of the film. Oh my god, how cool is that? And it's actually being used correctly as well. It's being used just as it's used nowadays to really give you that grand, huge scale landscape feeling in a story. And the fact that he did this here, like long before that concept, long before we even had 16:9, yet alone 21:9. Especially love when it uses all three cameras to make the French flag. For the first time seeing this wide aspect ratio being attempted, I cannot complain. It's not like the first time sound was used and that didn't really land. The music is just so good. I'm so into it. It really makes you like, yes, come on Napoleon, save France. Come on, I'm with you. Let's liberate France together. You're just there for the ride. You're there for the journey. The soundtrack just emotionally hitting every beat. This is the best silent film soundtrack in my opinion. So iconic and plays with the French national anthem in a really great way. I'm there to save France with you, Napoleon. This music, like, come on, let's save France together. Which, that sentiment, this is a very patriotic film. It very much is on Napoleon's side. And I think maybe by modern standards, it's a bit one-sided. Realistically, Napoleon did kill lots of people and was responsible for a lot of different bad things, I expect. Which I must give credit where credit is due. The new film does tackle that a bit better. But overall, this was going for something different. This was really celebrating the military career. This is a film of its time and it's a different take on the Napoleon story to what we would probably approach it at like now. One thing that is clear to me is Abel Gantz's is a lot stronger because it has a real passion, there's a real feeling and a real, like, it feels like Gantz really cares about Napoleon and how incredible he was as a character. He really has this attachment and he really wants to put that passion into the film. That passion is definitely not in Ridley Scott's film. This just ticks all the boxes for me. It's full of life, it's full of energy, interesting and original, and the story is great. Napoleon is a legendary character for a reason, you know, the story is good in this. But yeah, that's the end of this video. Thank you very much for watching. The next video will be covering the end of the silent era. So yeah, it's good to be able to be here and say, look how far I've come. I've almost covered all the silent films. Feeling quite proud of that. So yeah, I will be back then. Goodbye.